There are moments in history that feel less like events and more like memories we've inherited. Fragile, flickering things that don't quite belong to us, yet somehow live inside us anyway. The Christmas Truce of 1914 is one of those moments, a story told and retold until it feels almost like a legend, softened by time, wrapped in candlelight and snow. But beneath the sentiment, beneath the familiar images of men shaking hands in no man's land, lies something far more human and far more complicated. This is Memory and Valor. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. When I think about that particular winter, about the mud, the cold, and the exhaustion, I find myself returning to a single question. What does it take for ordinary men trapped in the machinery of war to choose peace, even for a few hours? And what does it mean that they did? Tonight, I want to walk with you into that question, not as historians and not as tourists of tragedy, but as people trying to understand a moment when the world paused, a moment when the guns fell silent, not because commanders ordered it, but because the men holding them simply stopped. There is something profoundly moving about that. Something unsettling, too, because if peace was possible on that frozen morning in 1914, if enemies could step out of their trenches and meet each other as human beings, then what does that say about the war that resumed the next day? What does it say about us? This is not a story about strategy or politics. It's a story about cold hands and tired eyes, about songs drifting across the dark, about fear giving way just briefly to curiosity. It's a story about the fragile, stubborn spark of humanity that refuses to die even in the bleakest of places. So, settle in with me, let the world outside fall quiet for a while, get a cup of tea, and together we'll step back into that winter, into the mud, the frost, and the candlelight, and listen for the moment when the war held its breath. Before we reach the night of singing and candlelight, we have to understand the world those men were living in. Not the world of maps and generals, but the world under their boots, the world they woke up to every morning and tried to sleep in every night. By December 1914, the Western Front had settled into a kind of misery that defies easy description. The trenches were not the wooden walkways we see in films. They were the raw wounds carved into the earth collapsing in on themselves, filling with water faster than men could bail it out. One French soldier wrote that the trenches were, quote, cesspools filled with a mixture of water and urine, and that the walls gave way with a soft sliver as if the earth itself were tired of holding the shape of war, end quote. Imagine standing in that day after day, the mud rising past your ankles, then your shins, the smell of mildew and rot clinging to your clothing, your hair, your skin, and the bodies of men and animals lying just beyond the parapet, too dangerous to retrieve, and their presence felt in every breath. Now remember, by Christmas 1914, the war was really only about 4 months old. And so that environment, the trenches that they were living in, were really in their infancy as far as structure goes. You were in the most basic of trenches. The cold didn't just bite, it settled into the bones. Great coats stiffened into frozen shells, rifles jammed, boots rotted from the inside out, trench foot spread like a quiet plague, turning feet dreadfully discolored, swollen, and numb. Men would wake in the middle of the night to find their boots frozen to the ground. And yet, in this bleakness, something unexpected was happening. A strange, unspoken understanding had begun to grow between the lines. Not friendship, nothing so sentimental, but recognition. A sense that the men across the wire were living the same nightmare. that they too were cold and hungry and exhausted, that they too were far from home, far from the people who loved them. Some units had already begun practicing what soldiers later called live and let live, a shot fired high on purpose, a lull in the firing at mealtimes, a shouted warning before a barrage. Small gestures, almost invisible, but very human. It wasn't peace, but it was the faint outline of something like it. And as Christmas approached, that outline grew a little sharper. The men knew the date. They counted the days not because they expected miracles, but because the calendar was one of those few things the war hadn't taken from them. Letters from home spoke of trees and candles, of carols and warm kitchens. The contrast was almost unbearable. Still, the idea of Christmas lingered in the air like a scent carried on the wind, a memory of a world that felt impossibly far away. And then, on the night of December 24th, something changed. Not in the high command. They were still issuing orders forbidding any friendly intercourse with the enemy. Not in the strategy. The war was still grinding on, indifferent to the season. What changed was the weather. After weeks of relentless rain, the sky finally cleared. The temperature dropped sharply. A hard frost settled over the trenches, turning the mud into a brittle crust. For the first time in weeks, men could walk without sinking. The air was still, and the stars were bright. It was as if the world itself had paused. And in that pause, something extraordinary began to take shape. It began, as extraordinary things often do, not with a grand gesture, but with something small, something almost easy to miss. A sound. Just after dusk on Christmas Eve, as the frost tightened its grip on the trenches, the British soldiers along certain stretches of the line noticed something unusual drifting across the dark. At first, they weren't sure what it was. The battlefield was full of strange noises. The creak of frozen sandbags settling under their own weight, the distant rumble of artillery far down the line, the restless shifting of men trying to keep their blood moving in the bitter cold. But this sound was different. It didn't echo like gunfire or groan like the wind through broken timber. It floated, it carried, it had shape. It was melodic. At first, it was only a single voice, thin, wavering slightly in the cold air, as if the singer were gathering courage with each note. Then another voice joined in, and another. Soon the sound grew fuller, rising from the German trenches in a gentle, steady swell. The British soldiers froze, straining to listen. Some lifted their heads above the parapet, risking a silhouette against the dim sky. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. The tune was unmistakable, even if the words were foreign. Stille Nacht, silent night. The melody drifted across no man's land like a fragile thread, weaving its way through the darkness, slipping between the barbed wire and the shattered tree stumps. It was a song the British knew well, a song many of them had heard in warm churches, in crowded parlors, in the soft glow of candlelit windows back home. But here, in the frozen mud of the Western Front, it felt almost unreal. Some men smiled without meaning to, others swallowed hard, caught off guard by the sudden ache of homesickness. A few mumbled that it must be a trick, some kind of German ploy to lure them into lowering their guard. But even though they couldn't deny the strange, disarming beauty of the sound, one British private later wrote that the singing seemed to float above the war itself, as if it belonged to another world entirely. And then, when the Germans finished their verse, a silence settled over the trenches, not the tense, brittle silence of men waiting for gunfire, but something softer, expectant, almost hopeful. It was in that silence that the British soldiers realized they were holding their breath because something was happening, something no one had planned, and something no one had dared to imagine, and it had begun with a song.
Then we sang our old Christmas songs, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, and O du fröhliche, O you grace bringing Christmas time. And the Tommies cheered and sang their songs too. The long way to Tipperary, the long way to go, and home sweet home. And then it was still.
Imagine hearing that in a place where silence had been stranger for months, a place where the night was usually broken by rifle fire, by the sharp crack of bullets snapping overhead, and by the dull thud of shells landing somewhere too close to forget. A place where the darkness itself seemed alive, shifting, groaning, whispering with the low moans of the wounded who could not be reached. Second Lieutenant Johann Niemans of the 133rd Royal Saxons recalled that, and we just heard from him. Silence in the trenches was never gentle. It was tense, brittle, the kind of quiet that made men grip their rifles a little bit tighter, the kind of quiet that meant danger, not peace. But this was different. The sound that drifted across no man's land that night didn't carry the jagged edge of violence. It didn't make men flinch or duck instinctively. It moved slowly, softly, as if it were feeling its way through the dark. It was singing, not loud, not triumphant, but steady, human, a thread of melody weaving itself through the cold air, fragile yet unmistakable. It rose above the mud, above the wire, above the fear that had settled into every man's bones. For a moment, the British soldiers didn't know how to react. Some stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Others simply froze, their breath catching in their throats. A few men, hardened by months of fighting, felt something inside them loosen, just a fraction, at the sound of a familiar tune carried on unfamiliar voices. Because in that moment, the battlefield did something it had not done in a very long time. It softened. The harsh edges of war blurred. The cold felt a little less biting, and the darkness seemed a little less hostile. And the men, exhausted, filthy, half frozen, found themselves listening to a song they had known since childhood, sung by the very men they had been trying to kill. It was a sound so gentle, so achingly out of place, that it felt almost like a memory drifting across the frost. Now, instead of gunfire, there was singing.
It started by, well, Merry Christmas, lads, talking in the trench. We can hear Jerry. He's chatting quite loudly this particular morning. And he's singing a Christmas carol, in German. A damn good singing too, and we're shouting, "Go on, Jerry," Encore, we're shouting. And a fellow come next, playing a cornet. Oh God, it was a good one too. And he was playing a carol with his cornet. It didn't half rattle out all them lands, It was beautiful to hear him play it.
Some British soldiers thought it was a trick, a ruse to lure them into exposing themselves. Months of fighting had taught them to distrust anything unfamiliar, especially anything that felt gentle. A few muttered warnings down the line, telling their mates to keep their heads down, to stay sharp, to remember where they were. But others simply stood there, stunned, listening to the purity of the sound drifting across the dark. It was so unexpected, so achingly out of place, that it took a moment for their minds to catch up with their ears. The melody was clear, steady, carried on voices that were tired but earnest, and it rose above the mud and the wire with a kind of fragile courage. One rifleman later wrote that it felt as though, quote, the war had suddenly stopped, just to hear this one song, end quote. As if the battlefield itself had paused, the cold, the fear, the months of violence, all held at bay by a single thread of music. And then something even stranger happened. The British answered. It began hesitantly, almost shyly. A few voices at first, roughened by cold air and weeks of shouting over gunfire. Their pitch wavered, their timing wasn't perfect, but there was something in their singing that the Germans' polished harmony didn't have. A kind of weary longing, a homesickness that clung to every note. They sang a carol of their own, one they knew from childhood winters, from candlelit churches and crowded parlors and the warm glow of hearth fires far from the trenches. Their voices rose into the night, uneven but sincere, carried by the same frost that had carried the German song moments before. When they finished, a ripple of applause drifted across no man's land. Genuine, warm, almost playful. The Germans cheered, calling out compliments in accented English. A few British soldiers laughed softly, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. Then the Germans began another carol. Their voices blended in rich harmony, practiced and confident, filling the cold air with a sound that seemed impossibly beautiful for a battlefield. When they finished, the British applauded in return, louder this time, bolder, as if the music itself had loosened something inside them. And so it continued, a British song, a German song, back and forth like a conversation carried on in music instead of words. No translation was needed. The melodies were enough. The emotion was enough. In that strange, fragile existence, the men found a way to speak to one another without lowering their guard, without stepping into the open, and without breaking the rules of war, and yet somehow breaking them all the same. For a little while the front line became something else entirely, not a battlefield, not a place of fear, but a place where two groups of exhausted men, separated by wire and orders and months of violence, recognized something familiar in each other, a shared memory, a shared longing, and a shared humanity. The gentleman we heard describing the German plane, the Coronet, was George Ashurst from the Lancashire Fusiliers. Next, we're going to hear from Rifleman Graham Williams, and he describes his experience with the Christmas truce when he was stationed near Armentières.
I was standing there on duty, gazing across, looking towards the German parapet. I thought, well, a very different Christmas this is going to be from any I've spent up till now. I thought about this time, at home we should have finished putting up all the greenery and holly and stuff. And my father would have been just finished making his rum punch, which he always did at Christmas. Anyway, I thought, my word, I could just do with a swig of that rum punch now, and feeling pretty miserable altogether. Then all of a sudden, lights appeared all along the German trench. And I thought, well, this is a funny thing. And then the Germans started singing, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. And I woke up, well, all the other sentries did the same thing. All woke up the other people to come along and see this. What on earth's going on? They finished their carol. We applauded them, and then we thought we must retaliate in some way. So we replied with the First Noel. And when we'd finished that, they all began clapping. And then they struck up another favourite carol of theirs, O Tannenbaum. First the Germans singing one of their carols, then we'd sing another of ours, until we started up, Come All Ye Faithful, and the Germans immediately joined in, singing the same thing to the Latin words of Adeste Fideles. And, well, I thought this was rather an extraordinary thing, really, to think of the two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war.
In some sectors, the Germans placed small Christmas trees, Tannenbaum, along their parapets, candles flickering in the still air. It was an image so unexpected, so defiantly gentle, that it took the British soldiers a moment to understand what they were seeing. The trees were tiny things, no taller than a man's forearm, their branches sparse and brittle from the cold. But the candles were astonishing. Little flames trembling in the darkness, their light reflected in the frost that clung to the wire. They cast a warm golden glow that seemed to soften the harsh lines of the trench, turning the jagged silhouette of sandbags and timber into something almost peaceful. The British stared at them in disbelief. Some rubbed their eyes, convinced the cold had finally begun to play tricks on them. Others whispered to their mates, asking if they saw it too. Those small, stubborn symbols of home perched atop a battlefield. A few men simply stood there, mouths slightly open, unable to reconcile the sight with the world they had been living in for months. One soldier later said he wondered if he had fallen asleep and was dreaming. And it's easy to understand why. The trees looked impossibly delicate against the backdrop of mud and barbed wire, like something smuggled in from another life. A life of warm parlors and crowded markets, of families gathered around tables, and of songs sung without fear. The candles flickered in the stillness, their flames steady despite the cold. They seemed to hold the darkness at bay, creating small islands of light along the German line. And for the British watching from across no man's land, maybe only 30 yards away, the sight carried a strange, almost painful beauty, because those trees, those tiny, trembling flames, were a reminder of everything the war had taken from them and everything it could not quite extinguish. Again, we're going to hear from the German Colonel Johannes Niemann, who was then a second lieutenant of the 133rd Royal Saxon. He recalled the activities in his trench that evening.
The next morning it was a bit foggy, firstly, and when we are taking our coffee and cake and in our dugout, then suddenly a orderly jumped in and cried, "The Tommies come on, and ours are also going upstairs."
And then came the shouts, not commands, not insults, but greetings. English, you come out? You no shoot, we no shoot. Voices carried across the frozen ground, tentative but hopeful. The kind of hope that feels dangerous because it asks you to trust someone you've been told is your enemy.
Later on in the night, there was a great deal of commotion going on in the German front line, which was about 100, 150 yards away, I suppose. And after a few moments, there were lighted objects raised above the German parapet, looking like Chinese lanterns to us. The Germans were shouting over to our trench. There's no doubt about that at all. And before we could take any action or do anything, we were ordered to open rapid fire, you see, which we did. The Germans did not reply to our rapid fire. They simply carried on with their celebrations, ignored us completely, and were having a very fine time indeed. We never did anything else but simply continue in our wet trenches, trying to make the most of the bad job.
That recollection came from Clifford Lane of the 1st Hertfordshire Regiment. So for a long moment, nothing happened. The singing faded into the cold air, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost physical. A silence that pressed against the ears, that made every man suddenly aware of his own breath, his own heartbeat, and the weight of the rifle in his hands. The men looked at one another, unsure. Some raised their eyebrows in silent question, others shrugged as if to say they didn't trust what they just heard, any more than the next man. A few shifted nervously, boots crunching on the frozen duck boards, their breath rising in pale clouds. The tension was a living thing coiled tight between the trenches. The rules of war were clear. The orders from above were clear. You did not trust the enemy. You did not expose yourself. You did not let sentiment cloud your judgment. But the night felt different. There was something in the air, a stillness that didn't belong to the battlefield. The frost had hardened the mud into a brittle crust, and the cold seemed to hold everything in place as if the world itself were pausing, waiting, listening. Even the usual sounds of the front, the distant thump of artillery, the crack of rifles far down the line, seemed muted, softened by the cold. The darkness felt less hostile, and the stars above strangely bright, as though the sky had drawn a little closer. It was as if the frost itself had stilled the violence, as if the earth, exhausted by months of bloodshed, had taken a deep breath and whispered, "Not tonight." And in that breath, that fragile, trembling pause, the men felt something shift. Not a decision, not yet, but the faintest loosening of fear, a tiny crack in the wall that war had built around their hearts. Right now, we're going to listen to another German officer, Walter Stenz. He was interviewed by BBC in 1968.
On Christmas Eve at noon, fire ceased completely on both fronts. Of course, it was unusual that the opposite side also ceased fire. Then my officer controlling the sentries came in and said, may I ask a question there? Do you expect a surprise attack? Because it's very unusual, the situation. I said, no, I don't think so. But anyhow, everybody is awake, nobody sleeping and so on, and the sentries are still on duty. I think it's all right.
Colonel Scott Shepherd in 1968 recalled the events for the BBC while visiting the place where his trench was near Armentières.
On Christmas Eve, we relieved the Scots Fusiliers, and we were amazed to find, all the reliefs of course took place at night, and we were amazed to find that the Germans had put little lit candles on Christmas trees all along the line as far as we could see. And the chaps in the trenches along this line roughly, in a very Christmassy mood, just took pot shots at the lights they could see. And there was a real Christmas spirit going on.
Finally, in one sector, a British soldier raised his head above the parapet. No shot followed. Another stood. Then another. A German soldier climbed out of his trench, hands raised. A British soldier did the same. And then, slowly, carefully, men began to walk toward each other across the frozen expanse of no man's land. It must have felt like stepping onto the surface of the moon, familiar earth beneath their boots, but a situation so impossible it defied belief. Private Marmaduke Walkington was there, and he tells us what it was like.
We were in the front line. We were about 300 yards from the Germans, and we had, I think, on Christmas Eve, we'd been singing carols and this, that, and the other, and the Germans had been doing the same, and we'd been shouting to each other, sometimes rude remarks, more often just joking remarks. Anyway, eventually a German said, "Tomorrow you no shoot, we no shoot." And the morning came and we didn't shoot and they didn't shoot. So then we began to pop our heads over the side and jump down quickly in case they shot, but they didn't shoot. And then we saw a German standing up, waving his arms, and we didn't shoot, and so on. And so it gradually grew.
One British private later said, I had to pinch myself to see if I was awake. The first handshakes were hesitant, almost shy. The men laughed nervously, unsure what to say. Some offered cigarettes. Others held out tins of tobacco or chocolate. A few simply stood there, staring at the faces of the men they had been shooting at only hours before. And in that moment, that fragile, trembling moment, the war truly did stop. Not everywhere, though, not for everyone, but in enough places that the night of December 24th, 1914, became something the world would never forget. A night when the guns went quiet. A night when enemies became, if not friends, then something close to it. A night when the frost and the starlight and the sound of human voices singing across the dark created peace that no general had ordered and no soldier would ever forget. There is a moment, a very small one, when history changes direction. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't arrive with fanfare, it simply tilts. And then on Christmas morning, 1914, the world tilted in the space between two trenches. Again, let's listen to George Ashurst, interviewed by the BBC in 1964.
Jerry's walking across, and he's a stick with a white flag on it, you know. Of course, when he gets halfway, he stops, which he has to do, you know. So we sent a fella out, brought him in. Well, he's a prisoner of war. When he gets in our lines, he's immediately a prisoner of war, because he's not been blindfolded. So our officers had to tell him that he was a prisoner of war. Best thing for him it was, you know, if he only knew it. The message said, like, could we have an armistice of 2 hours? From 11 o'clock till 1. And our people agreed.
So the frost had hardened the mud into this cold crust, and the mist hung low, softening the jagged edges of the battlefield. It was the kind of morning that felt suspended, as if the day itself were holding its breath. And then, in that stillness, a British soldier climbed out of his trench. Just one man at first, a silhouette against the pale light, his hands raised, palms open, a gesture as old as fear and older still than trust.
At dawn on Christmas morning, there was the usual stand to, of course, everybody manning their posts along this line. And as dawn came, the fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of you, as they always say. Presently, the fog lifted very quickly. It lifted astoundingly quickly. And along that line, we were able suddenly to see the Germans doing exactly the same thing, all out in the open. And we just looked at each other for some time, and then one or two soldiers went towards them. They came across no man's land, and just about out there where that plough line is, from there to, what would one say, 100 yards from here, they met, they shook hands, they swapped cigarettes, they got talking, and well, everything, the war for that moment came to a standstill.
From the German side, another figure emerged, then another, and another. At first, they were only silhouettes, dark shapes rising slowly from the trench line, outlined faintly against the pale winter sky. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as if each man were testing the air, unsure whether the fragile peace would hold. Some climbed out with their hands raised. Others kept their rifles slung but pointed downward, a gesture that was not quite surrender, not quite trust, but something in between. Imagine the sound of boots crunching on frozen earth, that crisp, brittle crackle, the sound of frost giving away underfoot, carried across no man's land with startling clarity. It was a sound the men had heard 1,000 times before, but never like this, never in the open, never without fear of a bullet following it. Imagine the way your heart would pound in your chest, not from danger, though danger was everywhere, but from the sheer impossibility of what you were actually doing. Every instinct, every order, every lesson drilled into them since August told them to stay down, stay hidden, stay alive. And yet here they were, stepping into the open, into the space between the lines, into a place that had belonged only to death for months. Some men hesitated, taking a few steps and then pausing, glancing back at their own trenches as if seeking permission. Others walked with a kind of dazed determination, as though the music had pulled them forward and their bodies had simply obeyed. Men who had spent months trying to kill each other now walked toward one another like cautious explorers stepping onto a new land. They moved slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid that a sudden gesture might shatter the moment. Their breath rose in pale clouds, their boots left crisp impressions in the frost, their hands hovered awkwardly at their sides, unsure whether to wave, to salute, or to reach out. It was a meeting of strangers who somehow felt familiar. A British corporal later wrote that the sight reminded him of two wary animals approaching a watering hole, each unsure whether the other would drink or bite. But there was no hostility in the air now, only a strange, trembling curiosity. The distance between the lines shrank. 20 yards, 10, 5. Faces came into focus. Young, tired, unshaven, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Not monsters, not faceless enemies, just men, cold, frightened, and human. And in that fragile space between them, something shifted. Something ancient and something deeply, quietly hopeful. They were no longer soldiers following orders. They were men stepping into a moment that defied everything they had been told war must be.
We stuck a board up, Merry Christmas. They also stuck one up, Merry Christmas. So we were saying, well, I don't think they'll fire today. No, I don't think they will. Then lo and behold, here was a German coming down the river bank with his hands up above. One of our chaps threw his equipment off. He went out to meet him. Well, they shook hands. Then we all got out. Company commander come rushing in. He was going to shoot any man that went over. His voice from the next base said he was too darn late. So we all had to get out. Well, we mucked in all day, talking one thing or another. One of the Germans said to me, and in excellent English too, well, he said, I don't know, he said. How long do you think this damn war's going to last? I'm fed up to the neck. Oh, I said, you were not the only one fed up. I said, we're up to our necks in water and mud. He said, we're the same. Of course, the officers have to get out then, and they sent for a couple of Germans back, and they brought some decanters, and the officers, you know, they had a damn good drink between them, see? And our company commander gave them a plum pudding, and they asked our company commander if he'd mind the company having 2 barrels of beer. He said, we got plenty there in the brewery. He said, I can assure you, it won't make them drunk. So, right-o, the 2 Germans wheeled 2 barrels out into the middle of no man's land. We rolled them back in the trench.
We just heard from Private Frank Richards, DCM, MM. He was with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. And it's worth it to note that he also wrote a few books, but one in particular remains sort of like a Bible when it comes to the experience of First World War soldiers. His book was entitled Old Soldiers Never Die. And if you have a moment to pick it up, I highly recommend it. Continuing on now from where Richards left off. One British private later said, "It was like meeting ghosts." Another wrote, "I felt as if I were walking into a dream." When they finally reached each other, there was that moment of hesitation, a breath, a pause, a flicker of uncertainty, and then hands reached out, gloves touched gloves, bare fingers brushed bare fingers, a handshake. Then another, and another. And it's hard to imagine the emotion of that moment. Relief, perhaps, curiosity, a strange, fragile joy, and beneath it all, something deeper, the recognition of shared humanity shining through the cracks of war. They began to talk, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. Many Germans spoke English, some with London accents from their years working in hotels and restaurants before the war. One German soldier called out, "I was a waiter at the Great Central Hotel." Another asked after the Gaiety Theatre, as if the war were just a brief interruption in the life he once knew.
I'll tell you what happened on Christmas Day, 1914, and people don't believe it. We had an unofficial truce. And we met in no man's land on Christmas Day, 1914. And we shook hands, they were Saxons. And I heard one fellow talking English. I said to him, "You speak English?" You know what he said? "Oh, blimey, mate," he said, "I was in the London Hotel when the war broke out." I thought that topped it. Yeah, oh, blimey, he got the London accent.
That recollection came from Archibald Stanley. The British laughed. They couldn't help it. The absurdity, the tenderness, the relief, it all mixed together in a way that felt almost holy. Cigarettes were offered, chocolate, buttons cut from tunics. A British soldier handed over a tin of tobacco from his Princess Mary gift box. A German soldier offered a cigar in return. Some produced bottles of schnapps. Someone else shared a photograph of a sweetheart back home. And all around them, the frost glittered like glass. In some places, the truce unfolded quietly. Small groups of men talking in low voices, exchanging gifts and stamping their feet against the cold. In others, it was almost jubilant. Laughter carried across the frozen ground. Men posed for photographs, arms slung around the shoulders of men they had never met before that morning. And those photographs have survived. You can see them on the Imperial War Museum's website. One British corporal wrote, "We were like old friends who had not seen each other for years." Now we're going to hear from George Jameson and also stretcher bearer John Wilkins.
Keith and Philip Ridley, two of my section, came dashing into the billet during the morning and said, "What do you know? The Jerrys are out on the top. They're walking about. They're dishing out drinks and cigarettes. There's no fighting going on." Well, we'd noticed the place was very quiet, you see. I said, "I don't believe it." Was I said, "Well, I can't go. I'm duty bloke for the morning on this, but hop off and see what you can find." So Keith and Philip and Leslie Wood went off, and they arrived back round about lunchtime. Keith with one of the Landwehr hats on, you saw that grey thing with a red band round the button. Philip had a water bottle. They'd had drinks, they'd had smokes, and they'd been walking about. He said, just wouldn't believe it.
They talked about the reason for the war, and they didn't want the war, and they didn't want the fight, and generalities like that. Nothing. There was no ill feeling, no bad feeling. Everybody was friendly. The only thing is, we didn't go near their trenches, and we wouldn't allow them to come near ours.
Peace, even the briefest kind, is never simple. But on that morning, that cold, bright, impossible morning, the men of 1914 crossed the frozen earth and met each other not as enemies, but as human beings. There is something profoundly moving about the way men give gifts in wartime, not because the gifts themselves are extraordinary, but because they are not. They are small, ordinary things, things carried in pockets, tucked into tins, and saved from rations, things that under normal circumstances would barely be worth mentioning. But on Christmas Day, 1914, in the middle of a frozen battlefield, those small things became symbols of something much larger. The first exchanges were tentative. A cigarette offered with that shy smile, a piece of chocolate held out in a gloved hand. British soldier pressed a tin of tobacco from his Princess Mary gift box, a brass tin embossed with the young princess's profile, sent to every man at the front. The German who received it nodded with a kind of solemn gratitude, then reached into his own coat and produced a cigar, rich and fragrant, the kind he might have saved for a celebration back home. Soon the exchanges grew bolder. Buttons were actually snipped from their tunics and cap badges traded hands. A British private gave away a small tin of jam. A soldier offered a slice of sausage in return. Someone produced a loaf of bread. Someone else shared a flask of schnapps. The air filled with the scent of tobacco and cold earth and the faint sweetness of chocolate melting on the tongue. One British corporal later wrote, "It felt like meeting long-lost cousins." There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that shakes the cold from your bones. Men joked about the weather, about the mud, about the absurdity of the situation. A German soldier who had worked as a barber before the war had set up an impromptu shop in the middle of no man's land, trimming the hair of British soldiers with a pair of small scissors. The sight of a man getting a haircut on a battlefield was so surreal that even the officers couldn't help but smile. In another sector, a German juggler, a performer in civilian life, gave a brief show, tossing small stones into the air with practiced ease. The British applauded. For a moment the war felt impossibly far away. And then there was the drunk German. In one British trench, a large, cheerful German soldier appeared unexpectedly, a bottle of beer in each hand, grinning from ear to ear. He had wandered too far in his enthusiasm, eager to toast the new year with his English friends. The British, amused but cautious, gently escorted him back toward his own lines, warning him that if he stayed much longer they'd have no choice but to take him prisoner. He laughed, slapped them on the shoulders, and stumbled off finally into the frost. We actually have an account of this from Henry Williams of the London Regiment. Listen to this.
And this runner came along when I was on this fatigue job, and so you're wanted again to interpret. I said, what is it this time? He said, well, there's a drunk German in our trenches and he won't go back. So I went up there, I saw a platoon officer there, and he said, oh, Williams, there's this chap here. He says, he's drunk. He says, I don't mind, talk very well to meet them in no man's land, but he's actually in our trenches. Anyway, this chap was standing over a couple of bottles of beer and wanting us to drink a health of the new year and all the rest of it. And he said, tell him he's got to go back. So I told him he wouldn't take any notice, he didn't want to go back. And this officer said, well, if he stops here, he's got to be made prisoner. Tell him if you ask him if he wants to be prisoner. So I did. Oh, what? Got nine, he said. And he understood that, but he wouldn't go back. So eventually, the officer detailed another chap and me to take him back. So he escorted there, one on each side, and this chap staggering about and singing at the top of his voice. We got up to the German wire, and I thought, well, I don't think I'll go right into their trenches, and they might not be as lenient as we are. Anyway, we found a gap in the wire and headed him in the right direction and left him to it.
But as incredible as all of this was, the war was still there, waiting. It lurked just beyond the edge of the frost. The guns were silent, but not gone. Their long dark shapes loomed behind the parapets like sleeping beasts, ready to wake at the first command. And when it really comes down to it, when you really think about it, once you've looked in the eyes of your enemy and you've seen a human being, it becomes harder to pull the trigger when the orders come. And so they knew the spell could break at any moment. A single shot, a misunderstood gesture, a nervous soldier on either side could shatter the fragile thread holding the moment together. But for now, for this one day, the men allowed themselves to be human. to laugh without flinching and to speak without suspicion, to stand out in the open without fear, to remember, however briefly, who they were before the mud and the barbed wire and the endless roar of artillery. And that was enough.
I remember very well Christmas. I remember the Christmas day when the German and the French soldiers left their trenches, went to the barbed wire between them with champagne and cigarettes in their hands, and had feelings of fraternization and shouted they wanted to finish the war. And that lasted only 2 days, 1.5 really, and then strict order came that no fraternization was allowed, and we had to stay back in our trenches.
Several of them spoke English. They were Saxons. They rather expressed their dislike for the Prussians and their dislike for the whole war, in fact. They weren't aggressive at all. And some of them said they'd been to London, been to England, and in fact they gave every indication of being glad to meet us.
For all the warmth and wonder of that Christmas morning, there was a truth lying just beneath the frost, a truth the men could not ignore. No Man's Land was not an empty field. It was a graveyard. For months, the bodies of fallen soldiers had lain between the lines, unreachable under the constant threat of sniper fire. Some were half buried in the mud, others were frozen in the positions in which they had fallen. The men on both sides knew their faces. They had watched them decay day by day, powerless to bring them home. But now, with the guns silent and the air still, the living turned toward the dead. The shift was subtle at first. A few men broke away from the clusters of laughter and conversation, walking slowly toward the shapes lying in the frost. Others followed. Soon the mood across the field changed, not abruptly, but like a candle flame dimming as a room grows quiet. And so we're going to listen to Wilkins and Shepherd talk about these burials.
As the day wore on, there were some corpses about from the little battle we had down there on the right on December the 18th, and every effort was made to give these a decent burial.
The Germans brought all the Worcesters that had been killed on the 18th of December over from their trenches over towards the centre. And they handed them over to us. We took them back behind the trenches and buried them.
British and German soldiers began to work side by side, lifting bodies onto makeshift stretchers fashioned from doors, planks, and greatcoats. One British officer later wrote that the scene felt like a service in a great cathedral, the roof of which was the sky. In one sector, the 6th Gordon Highlanders and their German counterparts gathered in what a soldier described as a waterlogged cabbage patch. There, they laid out nearly 100 bodies, British, German, and at least one Frenchman, side by side. The men formed two lines facing each other, caps removed, heads bowed. A British chaplain stepped forward. His voice was steady but soft as he began to read the 23rd Psalm. When he finished, a young German divinity student stepped beside him and repeated the words in German. One British captain later wrote that the student's voice was beautiful and expressive, carrying across the frozen field with a clarity that felt almost otherworldly. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. We're going to hear now from Jay Reid from the 6th Gordon Highlanders.
When we were holding the line at Saley, Christmas 1940, there was a bit of a truce there, you know, and the Germans stopped firing, we stopped firing, and we came out of the line, and they came out of the line, and we were swapping tins of bully for their tins of meat, and the padre was out having a talk with them, and they were burying any dead that was there, and we were burying any dead, and Oh, this carried on for about a couple of days.
2 candles were placed on the grave of a French soldier, their flames trembling in the cold air, and men from both sides stood in silence. It was a moment of shared humanity, but also of shared grief, because even as they buried the dead, the men knew that the peace they were experiencing was fragile, temporary, a pause, not an ending. Some soldiers whispered prayers, and others simply stared at the bodies, their faces drawn as if trying to memorize the stillness before the world shattered again. And yet, even in this solemn work, there were small gestures of tenderness. A German soldier gently straightened the collar of a British private before lowering him into the ground. A British sergeant placed a photograph he found in a German soldier's pocket back onto the man's chest. A group of men, British and German together, paused to wipe the mud from the face of a fallen comrade neither side could identify. These were not acts of politics or ideology, they were acts of human beings recognizing the humanity of others, even in death. We'll hear now from Henry Williamson.
Whole of no man's land, as far as we could see, was grey and khaki. There they were smoking and talking, shaking hands, exchanging names and addresses after the war to write to one another. Because the Germans started burying their dead, which were frozen out, and we picked up ours and buried them.
But not everyone felt safe in this moment of grace. One British private, after helping bury a German soldier, quietly showed a comrade the dagger he kept hidden in his tunic. "Just in case," he whispered. Peace, even the briefest kind, carried its own kind of fear. Still, the work continued, slow, careful, reverent. And when it was done, when the last body had been laid to rest and the final prayer had faded into the cold air, the men stepped back and looked at one another, not as enemies and not as soldiers, but as people who had shared something sacred, something that would stay with them long after the frost melted and the guns roared again. After the burials and after the prayers and after the quiet moments of shared grief, something shifted again. Not abruptly, nothing about that day was abrupt, but gradually. The men straightened their backs, rubbed their hands together for warmth, and looked around as if waking from a long, heavy dream, and the air felt lighter, the sky a little brighter, maybe. And in that fragile space between sorrow and laughter, someone, no one knows exactly who, produced a football. Some accounts say it came from the German side, others insist it was a British soldier who carried it tucked in his kit, a small reminder of home. The truth hardly matters. What matters is that suddenly, impossibly, there was a ball bouncing on the frozen ground of no man's land. At first, the men simply watched it roll. It must have looked like a ghost of normal life, something so ordinary it felt extraordinary. Then one soldier, a German, according to one witness, gave it a kick. A British private tapped it under his boot. A laugh rippled through the crowd, and just like that, the game began.
Suddenly a Tommy came with a football, kicking already and make fun. And then began a football match. We marked our goals with our caps. Tommy's did also. And we had much kicking, and then, after all, the Germans won the football game with 3-2.
It wasn't a match in any formal sense. There were no teams, no referees, no clear boundaries, just a mass of men chasing a ball across the rutted, frozen earth, slipping, shouting, laughing. Caps and greatcoats served as goalposts. It was mostly just a kickabout. The ground was uneven, pocked with shell holes and frozen mud ridges, but none of that mattered. For a few minutes, or perhaps longer, time moves strangely in moments like these. The war fell away. One British soldier later said, "It was the most natural thing in the world." Another wrote, "We were like schoolboys again." Johann Niemann of the 133rd Royal Saxons recalled the match vividly, and he remembered the laughter, the shouts, the breathless joy of running freely across a field that had been deadly only hours before. He remembered, too, the moment a gust of wind, or something like it, lifted the kilts of the Scottish troops, sending the Germans into fits of laughter. We roared, he wrote. We could not help ourselves.
There was everywhere much fun. But the greatest fun, that was for our soldiers, the Scotch kilt. We had never seen soldiers with skirts. That was a great astonishment for us. And then the greatest was when the Scotch soldiers turned his round and lifted her back. And then we saw she had nothing underneath. That was the stuff to give the troops.
So according to Niemann, the Germans won 3-2. Whether that score is accurate or simply a fond embellishment hardly matters. What matters is the image. Men who had been enemies at dawn now running side by side, boots thudding on frozen ground, their breaths rising up in white clouds of laughter. In some sectors there were multiple games. In others the ball was replaced by makeshift versions, a tin can, a bundle of rags tied with string. The joy was the same. And the officers, some of them, joined right in. Because how do you interrupt something like that? How do you step between men who have found for a fleeting moment a way to be human again? There is a photograph, grainy and kind of blurred by time, of British and German soldiers standing together after one of these matches, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Their faces are tired, but they're smiling, truly smiling. It is one of the most quietly powerful images to have survived the war, and I will post this on the website. And yet, even in this joy, there was an undercurrent of something bittersweet. The men knew, all of them knew, that this moment couldn't last. And for that brief, impossible interlude, they allowed themselves to forget. They allowed themselves to play. They allowed themselves to be young men on a winter's morning, chasing a ball across a field of frost. And in doing so, they created a memory that would outlive them all. There were others who looked upon the truce with something colder than disapproval. Far behind the lines, in the headquarters of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry, a young dispatch runner named Adolf Hitler reacted with open contempt when he heard what had happened. To him, the truce was not a moment of humanity, but a collapse of discipline. He reportedly scolded his comrades, demanding to know whether they had, quote, no sense of honor at all. Where the ordinary soldiers saw men like themselves, cold, frightened, exhausted, and longing for home, Hitler saw only enemies. Where they found moment of connection, he saw weakness. Even in 1914, long before the world knew his name, he viewed the war not as a shared tragedy, but as a test of ideological purity. It's a small detail, almost a footnote, but it casts a long shadow because it reminds us that compassion and cruelty often exist side by side, sometimes in the same army, sometimes in the same trench, and sometimes even in the same moment. And it underscores something essential about the Christmas truce, that it was not sanctioned, not encouraged, not welcomed by those who believed war required the erasure of empathy. In some sectors, the truce lingered into the evening. They exchanged final handshakes, final cigarettes, and final words of goodwill. A few men promised to write to one another after the war, though most knew such promises would be made more to soothe the heart than to be kept. In other places, the spell broke more abruptly, and George Ashurst explains this.
We got orders to come down the trench. Get back in your trenches, every man. The generals behind must have seen it and got a bit suspicious. Oh, we were cursing them to hell, us. Cursing the generals and that. You want to get up here in this stuff. Don't mind your big giving orders and your big chateaus and driving about in your big cars. Yes, we hated the sight of bloody generals. We always did, all through the war. They gave orders for a battery of guns behind us to fire and a machine gun to open out, you know, and officers to fire their revolvers at the Jerrys, you know. Of course, that started the war again.
In 1964, when Ashurst related that story to the Imperial War Museum, that was how the truce ended for him. A distant artillery gun, fired by a unit far from the truce, sent a low rumble across the lines. It wasn't aimed at the men in no man's land, but the sound was enough to remind everyone the world beyond this pocket of peace. Some soldiers flinched, others looked toward their officers, uncertain, and then came the orders. Back to your trenches. The truce is over. Return to your positions. In some sectors, though, there are accounts where the truce ended much more abruptly and with much less humanity. It ended with officers shooting a German to signify the end of the truce. In Captain Clifton Stockwell's sector, the end of the truce was marked with a strange, almost ceremonial grace. On the morning of December 26th, Boxing Day, Stockwell climbed onto the parapet, raised his revolver, and fired 3 shots into the air. Across no man's land, his German counterpart, Baron Maximilian von Sinner, appeared on his own parapet and raised a white sheet with the words, "Thank you," written across it. Stockwell raised a sign of his own, "Merry Christmas." The 2 men bowed to each other. Then von Sinner fired 2 shots into the air, and just like that, the war resumed. In other sectors, the return was harsher. British generals, furious at reports of fraternization, ordered artillery batteries to fire on any groups still lingering in no man's land. The shells fell with a violence that shattered the quiet, sending men scrambling back into their trenches, cursing the officers. One British private wrote bitterly, "The generals have ended our peace." Another said, "It was as if the world had woken from a dream and remembered it was supposed to be cruel."
One of these snobs, people that just got his commission, you know. And he came up the next day and said, "This has got to cease." Picked up his rifle and he shot one of the Germans dead. Straight out in the open. That was the end. That finished it. That war started again. Never finished in 1918, did it?
But even as the guns roared again, something had changed. The men who returned to their trenches were not the same men who had left them that morning. They had shaken hands with the enemies. They had shared food, laughter, stories. They had buried their dead together. They had seen the faces of the men they were expected to kill. Some soldiers found it harder to fire their rifles in the days that followed, and others deliberately aimed high. A few wrote home that they could no longer hate the men across the wire. They could hate the war, yes. They could hate the mud, the cold, and the endless orders, but the men were just like them. Of course, the machinery of war does not tolerate such softness for long. By early January, units that had participated in the truce were rotated out, scattered along the line to prevent any repeat. New orders were issued forbidding fraternization under any circumstances. Artillery bombardments were scheduled deliberately to break any lingering sense of goodwill, and this continued for a year. Following year, Christmas 1915, the bombardments happened again on Christmas Eve to prevent either side from hearing any caroling or celebrations. The war reasserted itself with a kind of grim determination, but the memory of that day, that one impossible day, stayed with the men who lived it. It stayed in their correspondence, in their diaries, in the quiet places of their minds, and it stayed in the way they spoke of the enemy, not as monsters, but as men. It stayed in the world's imagination long after the frost melted and the trenches filled with mud again. When the men returned to their trenches, the Christmas truce of 1914 slipped into the realm of memory. For many, it became the moment that divided the war into a before and an after. Before the truce, the enemy was a shape in the distance, a rifle flash, a helmet crest, a figure glimpsed through smoke. And after the truce, the enemy had a face, a voice, a laugh, a family waiting at home, a photograph tucked into a pocket. One British soldier wrote, "I no longer felt hatred, only sadness." Another said, "We had seen their humanity and they had seen ours." Henry Williamson, then a young private in the London Rifle Brigade, carried the memory of that day for the rest of his life. He wrote of the warmth and fellow feeling that rose up between the men, a warmth that made the years of slaughter that followed feel even more unbearable. He never forgot the German soldier who shared a cigarette with him, nor the strange, fragile peace that settled over the frozen field like a blessing.
Little crosses of ration box wood were nailed together, quite small ones, and indelible pencil they would put, the Germans, für Vaterland und Freiheit, for fatherland and freedom. And I said to a German, "Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom." And he said, "Excuse me, English comrade, but we are fighting for freedom, for our country." And I say, you also put, "Here rests in God an unbekannter, held. Here rests in God an unknown hero, in God." Oh yes, God is on our side, but I said he's on our side. And that was a tremendous shock. One began to think that these chaps, who were like ourselves, whom we liked, and who felt about the wars we did, and who said, "It'll be over soon because we will win the war in Russia." And we said, "No, but the Russian steamroller is going to win the war in Russia." Well, English comrade, do not let us quarrel on Christmas Day.
That very moving recording was done by the BBC. Alfred Anderson, a Scottish joiner who lived to be 109, spoke of the truce until the very end of his life. "I remember the silence," he said, "the eerie sound of silence." Every Christmas he would pause, just for a moment, and think of the friends who never came home, the frost, the singing, the stillness. For the others, the memory was more complicated. Some felt guilt for having shaken hands with the men they would soon be ordered to kill again. Others felt anger, not at the enemy, but at the war itself, at the machinery that had forced them back into the mud after tasting, however briefly, what peace could feel like. And yet, even with all its contradictions, that memory endured in the way soldiers spoke of the enemy afterward. Not as enemies, but as men caught in the same storm. It endured in the small acts of mercy that continued quietly along the line in the weeks that followed. A shot fired high, a warning shouted before a barrage, a stretcher allowed to pass unmolested. It endured in the stories told to children and grandchildren, stories that sounded almost too gentle to be true, yet were spoken with a kind of reverence. And it endured in the world's imagination, because the Christmas truce is not just a story about war. It's a story about possibility, about thin, fragile line between violence and compassion, about the way ordinary men, given a moment of stillness, chose to step out of the machinery of war and into the simple, ancient act of meeting one another as human beings.
I was more tempted to keep it going for a long time. I was, like a lot more, because it was so pleasant to get out of that trench from between them two walls of clay and walk and run about. It was heaven, you know, that.
So, as we look back on that day more than a century later, it is tempting to wrap it in sentiment, to see it as a charming footnote in an awful war. But the truth is deeper than that. The truce was not a miracle, it wasn't a fairy tale, it was a brief, flickering glimpse of what humanity is capable of when fear loosens its grip. A glimpse that frightened the generals, a glimpse that comforted the soldiers, and a glimpse that refuses to fade. And perhaps this is why the story endures, not because it was perfect, but because it was human, a short piece, fragile piece, but a real one. And sometimes, again, a moment is enough. And so, as we leave that frozen field behind, I find myself thinking about the men who stood there, cold, exhausted, frightened, and yet somehow still capable of choosing something other than violence. They didn't end the war. They didn't change the strategy or the politics or the machinery grinding around them, but for one day, they stepped outside of it. The Christmas truce didn't last. It wasn't meant to. But the memory of it, the singing, the handshakes, the shared cigarettes, and the football skidding across the frost has outlived every man who stood there. It's become a reminder, whispered across generations, that peace is not an abstract dream. It is a choice, a fragile, difficult, deeply human choice. As you go back into your own world tonight, Christmas Eve, I invite you to carry that memory with you, not as a sentimental story, but as a question, a quiet, persistent question. If peace was possible there, in the mud, in the cold, in the middle of a world war, what might be possible here, in our own lives, in our own small moments of fear or division? Before we close, I want to leave you with something that beautifully echoes the story we've explored tonight. If you've never seen the music video for Paul McCartney's Pipes of Peace, I invite you to watch it after this episode. It was released, I believe it was Christmas time of 1983. It's a gentle, moving tribute to the Christmas truce. Not a documentary, but a kind of visual meditation on the humanity that flickered across no man's land in 1914. McCartney plays both a British and a German soldier. And through that simple bit of storytelling, that video captures something essential, the idea that men on both sides were reflections of one another, caught in the same cold, the same fear, and the same longing for home. It doesn't try to explain the truth, and it doesn't try and analyze it. Instead, it lets you feel it, the hesitation, the wonder, the fragile warmth of that impossible day. And in its final moments, it leaves you with a quiet ache, the same ache that lingers in the correspondence and the diaries of the men who actually lived it. So when you have a moment, check it out. Let it remind you, as this story does, that even in the darkest winters, there are moments when people choose compassion over fear. And sometimes those moments are enough to change the way we remember the world. Thank you for joining me for this journey into the winter and the Christmas of 1914. Please rate, follow the podcast, and follow Memory and Valor on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can check out my website at www.memoryandvalor.ca. Until next time, may we all find moments of stillness and the courage to choose peace even when the world tells us otherwise. Keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on. Happy Christmas.